They weren't soldiers. They were farmers, men with soil under their nails and fear in their hearts, standing against the greatest empire on earth. No medals, no uniforms, just muskets passed down from fathers and a conviction that freedom wasn't something to be granted, it was something to be defended. When the British Empire marched across the Atlantic, it didn't see an army waiting for them. It saw scattered villages, untrained militias, a people too busy planting crops to plan revolutions. But beneath those fields lay something no empire could conquer: the will to stand. Twice in half a century, that will was tested. Once in the spring of 1775, when the first shots of rebellion echoed through New England farms. And again in 1812, when the empire returned to remind its former colony who ruled the seas and the world. Both times, the professional armies came. And both times, it was ordinary Americans, not generals or politicians, who decided the outcome. This is the story of the forgotten war that saved America. A story of farmers who fought the empire and, against all reason, won. By the spring of 1775, the peace between Britain and her colonies had become an illusion. For a decade, tension had simmered. Taxes, boycotts, protests, a slow tightening of a rope neither side could release. In London, ministers believed the unrest was local and temporary, a matter of discipline. In the colonies, farmers and shopkeepers had begun to see something deeper: a struggle over who truly owned the soil beneath their feet. Most of them weren't revolutionaries. They were men who rose with the sun, worried about harvests, and prayed for steady weather. They had no taste for rebellion, but they understood tyranny when they saw it. When British troops marched out of Boston on the night of April 18, 1775, they carried secret orders: seize the colonial stockpiles of gunpowder hidden in Concord, and arrest the leaders who had stirred defiance: Samuel Adams and John Hancock. They expected obedience. What they met was warning. Across the countryside, lanterns flickered and bells rang. The alarm spread faster than any army could march. Paul Revere's ride, later polished into legend, was only part of a larger truth. Entire communities were awake before dawn, passing word through barns and backroads that the redcoats were coming. At Lexington, the British column arrived to find a small line of militia waiting, farmers with old muskets standing in the chill morning air. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and uncertain. Their captain, John Parker, is said to have told them, "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." No one knows who fired the first shot, but within minutes the green was filled with smoke and screams. 8 colonists lay dead. The British pressed on to Concord, expecting to crush resistance entirely. Instead, they found the countryside alive with defiance. From stone walls, bridges, and farmhouses, militiamen emerged not as an army, but as hundreds of individual acts of courage. Every road became an ambush, every retreat a reckoning. By the time the British coats began their long march back to Boston, they were under constant fire. Farmers left their plows in the fields to take aim from hedgerows. Blacksmiths and ministers fought side by side. The empire that ruled a quarter of the earth was being driven back mile by mile, not by strategy, but by stubbornness. It was not a decisive battle by military measure, but it was the beginning of something no empire had ever faced before: a people willing to die for an idea. The British Army, trained to fight on open fields with clear ranks, now found itself trapped in a landscape that didn't obey its order. Winding roads, defiant civilians, and a belief system stronger than any command. When they finally staggered back to Boston, bloodied and humiliated, the world had changed. In a single day, the American colonies had transformed from protest to war. And the British officers, many of them veterans of Europe's grandest campaigns, were forced to confront the truth they had never imagined, that the rebellion they had come to suppress was not led by politicians or soldiers, but by farmers who had simply decided they would not bow again. In that defiance, a nation was born, not through declarations or signatures, but through smoke, fear, and the refusal to yield. Lexington and Concord were not just battles. They were a statement that freedom would not come from negotiation, but from resolve. And as the empire regrouped to crush this uprising, the world's most powerful military found itself facing something it had never prepared for. A war, not for land, but for principle.
And 3 decades after Lexington and Concord, the fields where farmers once bled for freedom had grown quiet. The new United States was still fragile, a patchwork of states held together by hope more than strength. Its government was young, its army small, its people divided. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire had moved on. Napoleon's armies thundered across Europe, and London's attention was fixed on survival. But even as British cannons faced France, the empire's shadow still reached across the ocean, and to many Americans, it felt as though independence had been declared, but not yet earned. British warships still ruled the seas. They boarded American vessels, seizing cargo and, worse, dragging sailors into Royal Navy service under the claim they were deserters. Each act was an insult, a reminder that freedom was fragile when the empire still controlled the world's oceans. The young republic seethed, its pride wounded, its sovereignty challenged. When war was declared in 1812, it was not with the optimism of revolution, but with the weary anger of a country tired of humiliation. Many in Congress called it a second war of independence. They imagined swift victories, quick glory, a chance to prove America's place among nations. But what followed was confusion, failure, and fire. The early campaigns were disastrous. American forces invaded Canada and were swiftly repelled. The army was small, poorly trained, and plagued by politics. Generals fought over orders, militias refused to cross borders, and in the north, entire regiments surrendered without firing a shot. The young nation's ambitions met the old empire's discipline and lost. But the war's true reckoning came in 1814, when the British, having finally defeated Napoleon, turned their full attention to America. Veteran troops, men hardened by years of war in Europe, crossed the Atlantic. Their orders were simple: make an example of this rebellious experiment in democracy. They marched on Washington. The capital, little more than a collection of unfinished buildings, had never seen real war. When British troops entered the city, they burned it. The Capitol, the Treasury, and the President's mansion. Flames lit the night sky as thunder rolled in from the east. Even nature seemed to mourn. The next morning, a storm swept through, lightning, wind, and torrential rain, extinguishing the fires as if to hide the nation's shame. To the world, it looked like the end of the American story, a republic humiliated, its capital in ashes, its army scattered. In London, some newspapers predicted the colonies would soon crawl back into the empire's fold. But they had misread the spirit that had first risen at Lexington. Across the countryside, resistance hardened again, not with grand strategy, but with determination. Militiamen, privateers, and frontier fighters refused to surrender, and in a small harbor city called Baltimore, that defiance would find its anthem. When British ships sailed into Chesapeake Bay in September 1814, they expected another easy victory. But at Fort McHenry, the defenders, merchants, mechanics, volunteers, held firm against a full night of bombardment. For 25 hours, rockets and shells rained down. By dawn, the fort still stood. The British withdrew. A lawyer, watching from a truce ship, Francis Scott Key, scribbled words that would become immortal. "Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave?" It did, and in that moment, the Republic's survival became its own kind of victory. The war dragged on until early 1815, ending not with conquest, but exhaustion. The Treaty of Ghent restored borders and offered no clear winner, but the truth was deeper. America had endured the return of its former master and survived. It had lost battles, cities, and pride, but not its independence. And when news of Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans arrived weeks later, fought after the treaty was signed, it transformed defeat into triumph. Farmers, frontiersmen, and free men had faced the empire again and refused to kneel.
The War of 1812 did not end with parades or treaties carved in marble. It ended with silence, the kind that follows exhaustion. But in that silence, something had changed. For the first time, Americans no longer saw themselves as former subjects of an empire, but as citizens of a nation that had survived 2 tests of extinction. The Revolution had declared independence. The War of 1812 had confirmed it. Factories that once relied on British goods began producing their own. Merchants who once looked across the Atlantic now looked west. The idea of America stopped being fragile. It began to feel inevitable. From the ashes of burned cities rose a new kind of confidence. It wasn't the arrogance of power, but the quiet pride of endurance. A sense that survival itself was victory enough. In the years that followed, the country expanded, not just across land, but in identity. A new generation grew up with stories of their fathers standing behind ramparts, not as rebels or colonists, but as Americans. The nation no longer needed London's recognition. It had earned its own. And perhaps most profoundly, the war reshaped how the world saw the United States. To European powers, this small republic had endured the wrath of the most powerful navy on Earth twice. It had held its ground against invasion, fire, and blockade. That resilience could not be ignored. The young country began to believe in its destiny, a belief that would fuel everything that followed: the Monroe Doctrine, westward expansion, industrial might, and a growing sense of purpose beyond its borders. The farmers who once fought with borrowed muskets would never live to see that transformation, but their legacy was its foundation. Their defiance had done more than preserve freedom, it had defined it. By the 1820s, the echoes of war had faded into memory, but its imprint remained in every institution, every song, every flag. The United States had entered the world stage not through diplomacy or empire, but through endurance, the kind that only ordinary people can summon when everything they love is at stake. The Republic endured, and in doing so, it became something the British Empire never expected, a nation that could no longer be subdued, because its strength no longer came from power, but from conviction. The farmers who left their fields, the sailors who guarded unarmed ports, the citizens who rebuilt what was burned,
They proved that conviction, not power, defines a nation's endurance. The forgotten wars against empire left no grand emblems of conquest, but they built something deeper, a national instinct to resist submission in whatever form it takes. That instinct became America's quiet inheritance. The idea that freedom is not a gift passed down, but a responsibility taken up. 2 centuries later, the battlefields have changed. Empires no longer arrive with muskets or flags. They come as influence, complacency, or the erosion of trust from within. And once again, the same question lingers. When freedom demands ordinary courage, who will answer? Because every generation inherits the same unfinished duty to protect what cannot protect itself. The farmers of Lexington and the defenders of Baltimore didn't fight for what America was. They fought for what it might still become. Their lesson endures, simple and unshaken. A nation's survival depends not on the threats it defeats, but on the people who refuse to stop believing it's worth defending. And so the challenge remains, not to celebrate their victory, but to live up to it.